Derrick Miles always believed that hard work could take him anywhere, even to the skies. But on this fateful flight, he realized that talent alone wasn't enough. A stubborn captain, a ghost from his past, and a life-or-death decision. Will Derrick prove his worth and break through the prejudice standing in his way? Chicago, winter 1995. Snow blanketed the sidewalks, and an unforgiving wind howled through the worn-down streets of South Side, a place often spoken of in hushed tones, where violence, poverty, and broken dreams were as common as the bitter cold. Derrick Miles, just 8 years old, pressed his face against the frost-covered window of their tiny apartment. His eyes trailed the faint white streak of an airplane fading into the gray sky. He didn't feel the cold, despite wearing only a thin, frayed sweater. There was only one thought in his mind. One day, I will fly. Derrick, you're standing there again. Come eat, sweetheart. His mother's warm voice pulled him back to reality. Olivia Miles was a night shift nurse at the local hospital. Petite and gentle-eyed, she carried the weight of exhaustion, the kind that came from years of working tirelessly to raise 2 sons on her own. Derrick took his seat at the small table. Dinner was simple, some mashed potatoes and a few leftover pieces of fried chicken from lunch. He hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Mom, can a pilot be black?" Olivia paused, her gaze searching his. "Why do you ask, baby? At school today, the kids laughed when I said I wanted to fly planes. They told me I should think about being a mechanic or a factory worker instead." She let out a slow breath. It wasn't the first time she had heard something like this, but it stung just the same. Taking his small hands in hers, she gave them a gentle squeeze. "Listen to me, Derrick. The sky doesn't care what color you are. If you're good enough, you'll fly. Just don't ever give up." Those words etched themselves into his soul. Derrick didn't say anything more that night. But from then on, every day after school, he made his way to the library, devouring every book he could find about airplanes and the people who flew them. Years passed, and Derrick grew up with a single, unshakable goal: to become a pilot. But the road ahead was anything but easy. As a teenager, he took a job at a fast food restaurant to help his mother with the bills. The long shifts stretched late into the night, the stench of grease clinging to his clothes. But every time he stepped outside after a shift, exhausted and aching, he would look up at the sky where the airplane soared and whisper to himself, "One day, that will be me." Yet no matter how fiercely he held onto his dream, he couldn't escape the doubt in people's eyes. When he applied for a high school aviation training program, a teacher pulled him aside. "Derrick, are you sure this is the right path for you? This field is highly competitive, and the truth is pilots from your background are rare." Derrick's fists clenched, but he didn't argue. He simply met the teacher's gaze and said, "I'll prove it." The whispers, the laughter, the skeptical glances, none of it deterred him. He pushed himself harder, enrolling in advanced math and physics classes because he knew he needed them to fly. And then the opportunity finally arrived. At 18, Derrick received the letter that changed everything: a scholarship to a prestigious flight academy. His hands trembled as he held the envelope. "Mom, I did it." Tears spilled down Olivia's face as she pulled him into her arms. "I always knew you would." But joy was fleeting. Reality came crashing in. While the scholarship covered tuition, living expenses and additional fees remained an unbearable weight. If he wanted this, truly wanted this, he would have to fight for it. So he did. Training was brutal. His day started at 4 a.m., working a morning shift at a cafe before rushing to aviation classes and flight training. At night, he took another job as a security guard to make ends meet. Exhaustion gnawed at him constantly. There were moments when his body ached so much it felt impossible to go on. But in those moments, he clung to his mother's words. "The sky doesn't care what color you are. Just be good enough." So he kept going. Florida Aviation Academy, 2008. Derrick took a deep breath, gripping the straps of his backpack tightly as he stepped through the academy gates. Before him stretched a vast campus, where hundreds of aspiring pilots bustled between classrooms and training grounds. Small training aircraft lined the runway in perfect rows, their engines occasionally roaring to life, a constant reminder. Welcome to the world of those who were born to fly. But the moment he entered the dormitory area, a different reality set in. He was one of the very few black cadets here. Curious glances, fleeting yet probing. Some barely paid him any attention, but others eyed him with thinly veiled skepticism, as if he didn't belong. "Hey buddy, you sure you're in the right place?" Derrick turned, locking eyes with a blonde-haired young man, his tone hovering between jest and judgment. "What do you mean?" Derrick asked, his voice calm. "Well, let's just say, I haven't seen many pilots who look like you." Derrick didn't respond, he simply smiled. This wasn't the first time, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. The first flight simulation training took place on the second day. Seated in the cockpit, Derrick felt a mix of nervous anticipation and exhilaration as his hands hovered over the control panel. Before him lay a maze of buttons, screens, and levers, an intricate symphony of technology he had dreamt of navigating since childhood. Their instructor, a former military pilot named Thomas Briggs, strode in. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering on Derrick longer than necessary before he spoke. "All right, who wants to go first?" A few hands shot up, but Derrick remained still. He wanted to observe first, not rush to prove himself. A cadet stepped up, took the controls, and promptly miscalculated the throttle, sending the virtual plane veering off the runway. Briggs shook his head before turning to Derrick. You want to give it a shot?" Derrick nodded. His heart pounded, but his gaze was steady. He slid into the seat, inhaled deeply, and powered up the system. His fingers moved with precision over the controls, as if he had done this 100 times before, in his dreams. Steady speed, gently pull up. The simulated aircraft lifted smoothly off the ground. A hush fell over the room. Then Briggs nodded. "Not bad, Miles. But remember, takeoff is the easy part. The real challenge is staying in control and landing safely." Derrick allowed himself a small smile. He had proved something today, but this was just the beginning. The months that followed were grueling. Theoretical lessons, relentless drills, mounting pressure. Derrick wasn't just fighting to master the craft. He was fighting to prove he deserved to be here, in a space where many doubted him. One evening, while studying in the dorm, a group of cadets sauntered in. Roger Mathis, tall, broad-shouldered, radiating arrogance, tossed Derrick's pilot cap onto the table with a smirk. "You know, Miles, I bet the only reason you got in was because of the school's diversity program." Snickers echoed around the room. Derrick clenched his textbook, but didn't lash out. Instead, he met Roger's gaze head-on. "Then stick around and see if I'm good enough." The answer caught Roger off guard. His smirk faltered, but he said nothing more. As the group left, Derrick exhaled slowly. The doubt in their eyes would never disappear. But instead of letting it break him, he would use it, fuel for the fire that would carry him higher. In his final year, Derrick was selected for a long-haul training flight, one of the most crucial evaluations for a pilot in training. He was assigned as co-pilot for a test flight from Florida to Texas. Seated in the cockpit of the Cessna Citation, Derrick's pulse quickened as he looked down the runway. Beside him, in the captain's chair, was none other than Thomas Briggs. "Ready, Miles?" Derrick took a steady breath and nodded. "Ready, sir." The engines roared to life, the aircraft accelerating down the tarmac. As the wheels left the ground, Derrick felt it again. That familiar rush, that unshakable certainty. "This is where I belong." The flight was smooth, but as they prepared for landing, a sudden crosswind jolted the plane. Derrick reacted instantly, adjusting the controls, stabilizing the descent. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but his grip never wavered. Finally, the wheels touched down, soft, controlled, perfect. As the aircraft rolled to a stop, Briggs turned to him, nodding slowly. "Well done, Miles. You're going to make one hell of a pilot." Derrick tightened his grip on the yoke, a deep warmth spreading through his chest. He had done it. Graduation day. Standing before his training aircraft, donned in his pilot's uniform, Derrick looked up. Overhead, a commercial jet soared across the sky, a silent reminder that this was only the first step in a much longer journey. No matter what lay ahead, Derrick knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was born to fly. JFK International Airport, New York, 2012. Derrick Miles adjusted the sleeve of his uniform, straightening the epaulets on his shoulders. 2 golden stripes, the mark of a first officer. In the small mirror mounted on the wall of the crew lounge, he saw his own reflection, a young man, his eyes steady yet unable to mask the flicker of nerves beneath. This wasn't just another flight. Today was his first official flight as a first officer for Atlantic Airways. Since childhood, he had dreamed of wearing this uniform, of sitting in the cockpit, commanding a steel giant across the sky. But now, standing on the precipice of that dream, he understood the real battle was only just beginning. Stepping out of the lounge, Derrick merged into the steady flow of flight crews moving through the terminal. Pilots and flight attendants strode with confidence, discussing schedules, weather conditions, and pre-flight procedures. Some greeted him with polite nods. Others glanced at him with barely concealed curiosity. He was used to it. A black pilot? Not something people saw every day. "Hey, you the new first officer?" A voice cut through the noise behind him. Derrick turned and instantly recognized the man who had spoken. Captain Jack Reynolds. Jack Reynolds approached with the effortless confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime in the sky. Tall, broad-shouldered, with graying hair and sharp, calculating eyes, he was a veteran with over 25 years of international flying experience. Derrick had heard of him before, a man respected for his skill, but also known for being rigid, old school, and not particularly welcoming to change. Jack stopped in front of Derrick, arms crossed, his gaze sweeping over him in quiet assessment. "Miles, right?" "Yes, Captain," Derrick replied evenly. Jack let out a quiet huff, then smiled, though it wasn't a friendly one. "I hear you're the company's rising star. Let's hope you know how to hold your own up there, and not just in some PR campaign." The air between them tensed. A few crew members glanced their way, but no one said a word. Derrick's hands curled slightly, but he kept his expression unreadable. He had heard these remarks too many times before. This was nothing new, and it wouldn't be the last time. Locking eyes with Jack, he replied, his voice calm and unwavering. "I'm here to do my job, Captain." Jack raised an eyebrow, as if surprised by the lack of reaction. "Good." He shrugged. "Then let's hope you can keep up. You know, back in the day, becoming a first officer meant logging thousands of hours and proving your worth. But now, well, times sure have changed." Derrick didn't take the bait. Words meant nothing. Only actions would speak for him. Jack turned and walked away, leaving behind a chill in the air. As Derrick watched him go, he knew one thing for certain. This flight was going to be anything but easy. JFK International Airport, 11:45 p.m. New York time. The airport loudspeakers echoed overhead as passengers settled into their seats, while ground crew hurried to complete the final preparations. Outside, the blinking lights of other aircraft dotted the night sky, suspended like stars in the void. Inside the cockpit of the Boeing 777, Derrick Miles sat upright, eyes locked on the control panel before him. This was the New York-Tokyo route. Over 13 hours of flight crossing the Atlantic Ocean, the Arctic, and the Pacific before touching down in Japan. His first flight as an official first officer. Beside him, Jack Reynolds, the captain, was going through the pre-flight checklist. The cockpit air was heavy and cold, despite the powerful engines roaring outside, alive with energy. Jack cast a glance at Derrick, his tone casual but laced with challenge. "You look tense, Miles. First time flying a long haul like this." Derrick kept his voice steady. "I've flown extended routes during training, but this is my first with Atlantic Airways." Jack smirked, as if the answer had been expected. "Well, let's hope you're ready, because up there's no room for mistakes." Derrick tightened his grip on the control column, but said nothing. Any response would either make him seem inexperienced or overly confident. Neither would win him points with Jack. Just then, air traffic control came through their headsets. "Atlantic 702, clear for taxi to runway 4L. Weather is clear, northwesterly winds at 15 knots. Departure in 5 minutes." Jack nodded, then turned to Derrick, raising an eyebrow. "Miles, you want to take the takeoff?" Derrick met his gaze. "Of course." Jack shrugged, indifferent. "Good. Don't screw it up." Derrick exhaled quietly, then eased the throttle forward, carefully adjusting the thrust. The twin G90 engines roared as the Boeing 777 rolled down the runway, gaining speed by the second. V1, decision speed, no turning back. VR, rotate, pull back on the yoke. V2, safe climb speed, airborne. Derrick pulled back smoothly, feeling the weight of the massive aircraft as it lifted off the ground, leaving behind the glow of the airport lights. The Boeing tilted at a perfect angle, slicing through the dark New York sky. Jack remained silent throughout the entire takeoff. Only when they leveled off at 35,000 feet did he finally speak. Not bad. Derrick recognized the rare acknowledgement, but it didn't mean Jack had changed his mind about him. We'll maintain a cruise speed of Mach 0.84. I'll handle the flight. You just assist as needed. Jack's tone was more of an order than a statement. Derrick frowned slightly. A first officer wasn't just an assistant. They were equally responsible for the aircraft, especially in critical decisions. But Jack didn't see it that way. He nodded, keeping his composure. Understood, Captain. An hour into the flight, Jack began his test. Miles, let's say we have a cabin pressure failure over the Atlantic. What's your move? Derrick responded without hesitation, following standard protocol. Deploy oxygen masks, descend to 10,000 feet, contact ATC, and prepare for an emergency landing. Jack nodded but looked unimpressed. Sounds right, but theory and reality don't always match, kid. Derrick didn't argue. Jack was testing him, pushing him, waiting for him to crack. Minutes later, another question. What if we lose Engine 2 over the Arctic? Derrick calmly detailed the necessary procedures. Jack merely shrugged. Sounds fine, but remember, the books won't teach you everything. Derrick smirked slightly and turned to Jack. I know, Captain, but they teach me enough not to screw things up. Jack held his gaze for a long moment, but said nothing. Outside, the night was endless, stretching over the Atlantic like an abyss. Most passengers had drifted into sleep, the cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow. Inside the cockpit, the tension remained thick. Derrick continued monitoring the instruments, but Jack barely acknowledged his presence, adjusting the flight path without so much as a glance. This wasn't a partnership. This was a silent battle. Derrick knew Jack didn't trust him. He was still waiting for a mistake, for proof that Derrick didn't belong here. But Derrick wasn't here to impress Jack. He was here to do his job. Then, on the radar, an area of turbulence appeared ahead. Derrick glanced at Jack, about to suggest a slight course adjustment, but Jack spoke first. Stay on course. A little turbulence won't hurt. Derrick hesitated. Was this the right call? Outside, the clouds thickened. Derrick gripped the controls tighter. Something didn't feel right. The Boeing 777 sliced through the midnight sky, leaving behind the faint glow of the city lights far below. The passengers were deep in slumber, the steady hum of the engines blending seamlessly with the quiet of the night. But inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Derrick Miles stared at the radar, his pulse quickening. A severe turbulence zone loomed ahead, bright red clusters flashing across the screen, indicating powerful wind shear that could send the aircraft into violent shakes if they didn't adjust course. Clearing his throat, he turned to Jack Reynolds, who remained unfazed, idly monitoring the flight data. Captain, we're about to enter significant turbulence. I recommend altering course slightly to avoid the worst of it. Jack flicked a glance at the radar, then shrugged. Just a little rough air. We'll fly straight through. Nothing to worry about. Derrick frowned. Nothing to worry about? A red warning on the radar was anything but minor. He kept his voice steady, though tension coiled in his chest. According to weather data, this is more than just light turbulence. A slight deviation south could keep us out of the worst of it. Jack leaned back in his seat, arms crossed. Miles, I've flown the North Atlantic hundreds of times. These winds? They're nothing. If we rerouted for every bit of turbulence, we'd never get to Tokyo on time. Derrick knew Jack didn't like being challenged. But this wasn't about ego. This was about safety. He took a measured breath before speaking again, his tone calm but firm. I respect your experience, Captain, but safety comes first. If the turbulence is stronger than expected, we're taking an unnecessary risk. Jack's eyes darkened, a sharp edge in his voice. Miles, do you know who the captain of this flight is? Derrick held his gaze for a beat, then gave a slight nod. Of course, you're the captain. Jack nodded slowly. Good, then let me make the decisions. Without another word, he nudged the yoke forward, keeping their course unchanged. Derrick clenched his hands into fists against his thighs. He had done his part. He had given the warning. If anything went wrong, this wouldn't be his mistake. And then, less than 10 minutes later, boom! The cockpit lurched violently. The aircraft bucked and trembled, control panels rattling as warning lights flickered across the dashboard. A sharp alarm blared through their headsets. Warning! Severe turbulence ahead. Wind shear detected. 45 knots. Outside, the storm had arrived. Without warning, powerful wind currents thrashed the massive aircraft, tossing it like a toy boat in a raging sea. Jack's hands clamped onto the yoke, his previously calm expression now tight with focus. God damn it, he cursed, pushing the throttles forward to maintain altitude. Derrick was already scanning the instruments, adjusting the systems in real time. Winds are too strong. We need to descend to 30,000 feet to escape the turbulence. Jack held course, but now, even he knew he had miscalculated. The shaking intensified. Overhead compartments rattled, the muffled cries of passengers echoing through the cockpit door. Flight attendants braced themselves, trying to keep calm as they reassured the frightened travelers. Derrick turned to Jack, his voice urgent, unwavering. Captain, we need to descend now. Jack's jaw tensed. He hated admitting mistakes, but this wasn't about pride anymore. Finally, he gave a sharp nod. Fine, take us down to 30,000 feet. Derrick immediately adjusted the controls, assisting Jack as they lowered altitude. 30 seconds later, the turbulence eased. The violent jolts softened into a manageable tremor. The aircraft stabilized. Silence settled over the cockpit. Jack said nothing, but the look on his face told Derrick everything. He had been wrong. A moment later, the flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom. Captain, we have a few passengers in distress. Some minor injuries from the turbulence. Jack muted the microphone, exhaling through his nose. He turned to Derrick. For the first time on this flight, the disdain was gone. But instead of acknowledging his mistake, he simply muttered, Go check on the passengers. Derrick knew exactly what Jack was doing. He was avoiding the truth. Still, Derrick didn't push it. He simply unbuckled his harness and stood up. On it, first-class cabin. As Derrick walked through first class, he saw pale faces and shaking hands. A woman clutched her young son tightly, whispering reassurances. A middle-aged man was still breathing heavily, gripping his armrests. A flight attendant tended to an elderly passenger with a minor cut on his forehead. Derrick crouched down, keeping his voice as calm and steady as possible. I'm sorry about that turbulence. We've got everything under control now, and we'll make sure the rest of the flight is smooth. The woman with her son looked up, her voice tentative. I heard the captain refused to change course, but you did, didn't you? You got us out of that turbulence. Derrick gave a small smile. We work as a team to keep everyone safe. He didn't say more, but deep down, he knew the truth. Tonight, Jack Reynolds had made a critical mistake, and he knew it. Derrick returned to the cockpit after checking on the passengers. He shut the door behind him with a quiet click, the sound barely breaking the tense silence that lingered between them. Jack Reynolds sat in the captain's seat, eyes fixed on the instrument panel, but his hands were clasped together, fingers interlocked as if lost in thought. Derrick slid into his chair and went over the system checks. The hostility between them had dimmed, but the air was still thick with unspoken words. Finally, Jack spoke, his voice lower, more subdued than before. Passengers okay? Derrick nodded. Some panic, a few minor injuries from the turbulence, but nothing serious. Jack gave a small nod, saying nothing more. Derrick stole a glance at him. He didn't need Jack to say it. The captain knew Derrick had been right, but a man like Jack Reynolds didn't admit mistakes easily. Time passed. The aircraft cruised smoothly now, the GPS display showing they had left the Atlantic behind, approaching Arctic airspace. Jack hadn't said a word about the turbulence incident. But then, out of nowhere, he asked, "Miles, have you ever flown over the Arctic before?" The question caught Derrick off guard, but he answered without hesitation, "Not yet, but I've studied the flight conditions extensively. The cold air currents and magnetic interference can disrupt navigation systems." Jack nodded, his gaze no longer carrying its usual sharpness. "That's right. Magnetic compasses become unreliable near the pole. Even GPS signals can get distorted. That's why we rely on INS, inertial navigation systems." Derrick listened in silence. For the first time, Jack wasn't testing him. He was sharing experience, not as a challenge, but as guidance. Jack glanced at him briefly before continuing. "I had a flight once years ago. We lost our NAV systems over the Arctic. Everything went dark. If I hadn't known how to navigate manually, we wouldn't have made it back." Derrick absorbed every word. This was a lesson Jack had learned the hard way. For a while, neither of them spoke. The steady hum of the engines filled the cockpit. Then, Jack inhaled deeply before speaking again. "You know, Miles, I've flown with a lot of first officers in my career, and I have to admit..." Derrick looked up, waiting. Jack smirked. Not the condescending smirk from before, but something different. "You keep your cool pretty damn well." Simple words, but coming from Jack Reynolds, they carried weight heavier than any compliment Derrick had ever received. The man who once doubted him was now acknowledging him, if only a little. Derrick didn't let the moment linger. He simply gave a small nod. "Appreciate it, Captain." Jack turned back to the radar, his voice quieter now. "You've got a lot to learn, but I don't think you're the type to back down easy." Derrick let out a small chuckle. "I fought too hard to get here. I'm not about to let anyone or anything stand in my way." Jack gave him a long look. There was something unreadable in his expression, maybe understanding, maybe something else. But he didn't say another word. Outside, the Boeing 777 soared into the Arctic sky, cutting through the endless stretch of cold darkness. The tension between them hadn't disappeared entirely, but something had shifted. Jack Reynolds no longer saw Derrick as just a rookie with a lucky break. Trust wasn't built in a single night, but for the first time, Derrick had made Jack see him differently. And that was the first step toward changing everything. Over the North Pacific, 6:15 a.m., Tokyo time. The Boeing 777 glided smoothly through the early morning sky as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. Below, an endless stretch of soft, white clouds sprawled out like a tranquil sea. Inside the cockpit, the tension had eased, if only slightly. After the turbulence over the Atlantic, Jack Reynolds no longer looked at Derrick with outright disdain. He hadn't fully accepted him, but the skepticism in his eyes had diminished. Derrick ran a routine system check, ensuring all readings were stable. Jack glanced at him briefly, then gave a small nod. "I'm going to take a break. You've got this." For the first time during the flight, Jack handed over responsibility without hesitation. Derrick gave a slight nod, saying nothing. It was a small shift, but to him, it meant everything. On long-haul flights, one of the first officer's key duties was to check on the cabin, ensuring everything was running smoothly. Unbuckling his harness, Derrick stepped out of the cockpit and into the business class cabin. Soft, golden lighting bathed the luxurious space, where most passengers were either asleep or quietly enjoying a light meal. A familiar face greeted him. Sarah, one of the flight attendants he'd met before takeoff. "Everything all right, First Officer Miles?" she asked with a polite smile. Derrick nodded. "Any issues?" "Nothing major. A few restless passengers, some extra coffee requests. The usual." Derrick returned a faint smile before continuing down the aisle. Everything seemed to be in order. Then he saw him. At seat 3A, sipping a glass of red wine, sat a man Derrick had hoped never to see again. Roger Mathis. The name hit him like a punch to the chest. Roger Mathis, the boy who had tormented him all throughout high school. A broke kid from South Side wants to be a pilot? Keep dreaming, Miles. The memories crashed into him. The taunting laughter in the classroom, the shoves in the hallways, the jeering every time Derrick spoke about his dream. For a brief second, his pulse spiked. But then, he exhaled slowly, regaining control. He wasn't that scared, powerless kid anymore. But Roger? He hadn't changed. The moment he spotted Derrick in uniform, his eyes flickered with shock, only to quickly shift into amusement. Well, look who we have here. Roger smirked, setting his glass down. Derrick kept his voice calm, professional. Good morning, Mr. Mathis. Can I assist you with anything? Roger leaned back in his seat, eyes trailing Derrick from head to toe, as if he still couldn't believe what he was seeing. I can't believe it. Last time I saw you, you were bussing tables at some diner. How the hell did you get up here? A flicker of anger stirred inside Derrick, but he didn't let it show. He'd faced Jack Reynolds. He sure as hell wasn't about to be rattled by Roger Mathis. His reply was simple, steady, through hard work and skill. Roger let out a laugh, shaking his head like he'd just heard the most ridiculous thing in the world. You're kidding, right? I always thought this job was for people with the right connections, or at least the right background. Derrick didn't bother responding. People like Roger would never understand the value of perseverance. Roger swirled his wine lazily, his eyes still fixed on Derrick. Tell you what, Miles, I really hope you know what you're doing. I have a very important meeting in Tokyo, and I'd hate for you to screw it up. Derrick's hands curled slightly into fists, but his voice remained cool, unwavering. You can rest assured, Mr. Mathis. My job is to get all passengers to their destinations safely, including you. Roger scoffed, as if the idea of Derrick being responsible for his safety was absurd. Yo, we'll see. Funny though, I never thought you'd make it this far. But don't fool yourself, Miles. Just because you're here doesn't mean you belong here. For the first time, Derrick truly saw Roger for what he was. Just another insecure man trying to mask his own weakness. Roger might have stayed the same, but Derrick hadn't. He no longer needed Roger's approval. He no longer needed to prove anything. The only thing that mattered was doing his job. Derrick met his former bully's gaze, his voice firm, unshaken. Appreciate the advice, Mr. Mathis. Enjoy the rest of your flight. With that, Derrick turned and walked away, leaving Roger sitting there, smirking, but this time, without the power to hurt him. Because this time his words meant nothing. Derrick walked slowly toward the rear of the business class cabin, inhaling deeply to steady himself. The encounter with Roger Mathis had stirred memories he thought he'd buried long ago. But he wasn't that kid anymore. He wasn't the waiter Roger had once mocked. He was a pilot. He had earned his place here. Just as Derrick convinced himself that the conversation was over, Roger's voice cut through the air behind him. Miles, I don't think we're done talking yet. Derrick stopped, turned. Roger had risen from his seat, wine glass still in hand. An infuriating smirk stretched across his face. He took a slow step forward, that same old arrogance hanging off him like an expensive suit. You don't seem too thrilled to catch up with me, huh? Roger chuckled. I'm guessing you still remember the good old days? Derrick kept his expression neutral, but inside, the memories flashed like a film reel. The cafeteria taunts, the laughter every time he spoke of his dream, the way Roger and his friends would corner him in the hallways, just to remind him that he was less. Derrick blinked once, pushing those thoughts away. The past had no power, unless he gave it power. I don't have any issues with the past, Derrick said evenly. If you need something, I'm here to assist you. Roger let out a scoff. Assist me? He raised an eyebrow, shaking his head with amusement. Do you really think you can help me? Derrick held his gaze, said nothing. Passengers nearby had started to take notice. Roger wasn't bothering to keep his voice down. If anything, he wanted an audience. I'm just curious, Miles, Roger went on, his voice dripping with feigned intrigue. How exactly did you end up here? Because I remember high school, and you had nothing. No money, no connections. A broke kid from Southside dreaming of being a pilot? Did you really make it here all on your own? Derrick's fists tightened at his sides, but his face remained unreadable. This wasn't high school, and he had nothing to prove. I got here through skill and hard work, Derrick said firmly. Not everyone needs a path laid out for them. For the first time, Roger's smirk faltered, just slightly. But he recovered quickly, taking a slow sip of his wine before shrugging. Well, either way, I hope you're good at your job. I have an important meeting in Tokyo, and it'd be a real shame if we landed late." Derrick raised an eyebrow. "Safety is our top priority, sir. I'll make sure you get there on time. But more importantly, I'll make sure you get there safely." Roger's smirk returned, a lazy, mocking expression. "Good, because I really don't want to end up crashing into the Pacific." A few passengers turned their heads at that remark. Derrick could feel the ripple of uncertainty moving through them. Even a joke like that, spoken in the wrong place at the wrong time, could plant doubt. And Derrick couldn't let that happen. He took a steady breath and kept his tone professional, unwavering. "Atlantic Airways has some of the best trained pilots in the industry. You have nothing to worry about." Roger studied him, eyes gleaming with something almost enjoyable. He was testing Derrick, waiting for a crack. "You really have changed, Miles," Roger mused, swirling his wine. "But I wonder, do you really believe you belong here?" The words landed like a knife. Do you really belong here? For a moment, the ghosts of every doubt he had ever faced resurfaced. The way his high school teachers looked at him when he said he wanted to fly. The way his flight academy peers questioned if he'd been accepted because of a diversity quota. The way Jack Reynolds had sized him up on their first day together in the cockpit. But then Derrick realized something. He had never doubted himself. Only other people had, and he didn't need their approval. He looked Roger directly in the eye. "I don't need to wonder that," Derrick said slowly, each word deliberate. "Because I know I belong here." For the briefest second, Roger hesitated. But then he simply shrugged. "If you say so." Derrick didn't reply, because this conversation was over. With a simple nod, he turned and walked away. Derrick stepped back into the cockpit, quietly shutting the door behind him. The familiar stillness of the flight deck surrounded him, but inside his head, Roger Mathis's words still echoed. "Do you really believe you belong here?" Derrick sank into the first officer's seat, inhaling deeply, forcing the remnants of that conversation out of his mind. Professionalism. It was the core of being a pilot. He couldn't let personal emotions interfere with the job. Across the cockpit, Jack Reynolds was reviewing the control panel when he flicked a glance in Derrick's direction. "You all right?" Derrick hesitated, just for a second. It was the first time Jack had asked him anything with actual concern. He gave a short nod. "I'm fine." Jack didn't press further, but he studied Derrick for a moment longer before turning back to the flight instruments. There was something different about Jack's silence now. It wasn't the same dismissive, skeptical quiet from earlier in the flight. It was a thoughtful kind of silence, one of consideration. Jack had noticed that something had happened in the cabin. Minutes passed, the only sound the steady hum of the engines. Then, out of nowhere, Jack spoke again. "You know, Miles, not everyone likes seeing you here." Derrick turned to look at him, waiting for him to continue. "There are people," Jack paused, choosing his words carefully, "who get uncomfortable when someone like you rises, succeeds in a place they don't think you belong." Derrick didn't respond right away, because he knew Jack wasn't just talking about Roger. He was talking about himself, too. Jack exhaled slowly, still staring straight ahead. "But that doesn't matter," he continued. "What matters is whether you can do the job. And from what I've seen so far, you can." It wasn't an outright compliment, but coming from Jack Reynolds, it was as close as it got. A subtle weight lifted off Derrick's shoulders. He gave a slow nod. "Thank you, Captain." Jack shrugged. "Don't thank me. You earned that yourself." The Boeing 777 continued its steady journey across the Pacific Ocean. The sun had fully risen now, its golden light gleaming off the aircraft's massive wings. Derrick felt a sense of clarity settle over him. For the first time since stepping into this cockpit, he felt something shift between him and Jack. Respect. Jack Reynolds wasn't the kind of man to change his mind easily. But something about this flight, the way Derrick had handled Roger, the way he had kept his composure, it had forced Jack to see him differently. Trust wasn't won overnight, but this was the beginning. Derrick's fingers tightened slightly around the control column. His gaze locked onto the endless sky ahead. There were still battles to fight, still doubts to silence. But one thing was certain now. He belonged here. The Boeing 777 of Atlantic Airways soared over the open waters off Japan, inching closer to Tokyo airspace. After more than 12 hours in the air, The long journey from New York was nearly complete. Everything seemed smooth. Inside the cockpit, Derrick Miles ran a final systems check. The aircraft cruised at 37,000 feet, set to begin descent in 30 minutes for landing. Beside him, Captain Jack Reynolds remained focused on the radar. The tension that had once filled the flight deck had faded. For the first time all night, Derrick felt relief. His first flight as an official first officer was about to end successfully. Then, a sharp voice crackled through the intercom. "Captain, First Officer, this is Sarah from business class. We have a medical emergency." Derrick and Jack snapped upright. Jack hit the comm switch, his voice instantly sharp. "What's the situation?" "It's Roger Mathis, seat 3A. He's experiencing severe chest pain and difficulty breathing. A doctor on board suspects a heart attack. We need immediate assistance." Derrick froze for half a second at the name. Roger Mathis. Of all people. But he didn't have time to dwell on it. "I'll check on him." Derrick unbuckled his harness and was already on his feet. Jack gave a curt nod. "Go." Business class cabin. The moment Derrick stepped into business class, he spotted the commotion. A small group of flight attendants crowded around seat 3A. Roger Mathis was slumped forward, his face pale, sweat beading down his forehead. The arrogant confidence he had always carried gone. A middle-aged doctor knelt beside him, 2 fingers pressed against Roger's wrist, expression grim. "His pulse is weak," the doctor muttered. "Classic signs of acute myocardial infarction. If he doesn't receive medical intervention soon, he may not make it." Sarah, the lead flight attendant, turned to Derrick, urgency in her voice. "Can we divert for an emergency landing?" Derrick's heart pounded. An emergency landing wasn't a simple decision. It would disrupt hundreds of passengers, cost the airline hundreds of thousands of dollars, and trigger an investigation. But if they didn't land, Roger Mathis might die at 37,000 feet. Derrick looked at Roger, the same man who had mocked him, belittled him, doubted him, now helpless. But Derrick wasn't Roger Mathis. He couldn't stand by and do nothing. Taking a steady breath, Derrick turned to Sarah. "Inform the cockpit. I recommend an emergency landing at the nearest airport." Sarah nodded and immediately relayed the message. Derrick then turned to the doctor. "How long can he hold on?" The doctor checked his watch. "Maybe 30 minutes, maybe less. If he crashes, I won't be able to do much at this altitude." 30 minutes. That was exactly how long it would take to reach Tokyo. But would Roger make it that far? Cockpit, the argument. Derrick stormed back into the cockpit, voice firm. "We need to divert. Roger Mathis might be having a heart attack. If we don't land soon, he may not survive." Jack whipped around to face him, his eyes sharp as steel. "An emergency landing?" Jack's brow furrowed. "Miles, we're 1 hour from Tokyo. Do you understand what that means?" Derrick had expected this reaction. Emergency landings meant corporate losses, delays, paperwork, and scrutiny. And Jack hated unnecessary risks. But this wasn't about money. It was about a life. Derrick stood his ground. "If we do nothing, a passenger may die before we reach Tokyo." Jack exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Miles, I've flown thousands of flights. I've seen dozens of medical cases on board. We don't divert unless it's absolutely necessary. We're close enough to Tokyo. Why take the risk?" Derrick clenched his fists. "Because it's not just a passenger. It's a human being. And a human life is worth more than a flight schedule." The cockpit filled with a tense silence. Jack's jaw tightened. Derrick could see it, the battle in his captain's mind. Derrick's grip on the seat tightened. He had one chance to make Jack listen. He took a deep breath and made his final argument. "Cockpit, Boeing 777, somewhere over Japan." The air inside the cockpit had grown thick, suffocating. Jack Reynolds' grip tightened around the yoke, his gaze locked on the radar. Beside him, Derrick Miles sat rigid, his jaw clenched, voice firm despite the tension coursing through him. "We need to initiate an emergency landing. Now," Derrick pressed. "A passenger's life is at stake." Jack exhaled slowly, turning to Derrick with icy precision in his stare. "Do you even understand what an emergency landing means, Miles?" Derrick didn't flinch. "I understand perfectly. Jack's jaw tightened, his voice like stone. If we change course now, the airline takes a massive loss. Hundreds of thousands in compensation. The aircraft gets pulled for immediate inspection, delaying future flights. And on top of that, we'll have hundreds of furious passengers. Derrick held his ground. Do any of those things matter more than a human life? Jack tapped his fingers against the control panel, eyes narrowing. You think I haven't dealt with medical emergencies before? We're less than an hour from Tokyo. If it's a heart attack, a fully equipped hospital in Tokyo gives him the best chance. Not some halfway airport with limited facilities. Derrick's fists curled. Jack was thinking about money. Derrick was thinking about Roger's life. Can you guarantee he'll survive another hour? Derrick demanded. Jack didn't answer. Instead, his voice dropped to something calm, almost quiet. You know, Miles, Jack murmured. I've seen plenty of first officers who think they can make captain-level decisions, only to crash and burn. Do you think you know better than me? Derrick had been waiting for this challenge. His response was immediate, unwavering. I'm not saying I know more than you. I'm saying I know what's right. Jack clenched his jaw, staring at him. Two men, two perspectives, two generations colliding in the cockpit. You don't get it, Miles, Jack snapped. An emergency landing isn't just a medical decision. It's an economic one. It's risk management. Do you really think the airline will back us on this? Derrick knew this was the moment. The final push. He inhaled deeply, locking eyes with Jack. And what happens if he dies mid-flight, Captain? Derrick's voice was deadly calm. What's our explanation then? Jack opened his mouth, but no words came. Derrick had struck the weak spot. Silence thickened between them. Derrick refused to look away. He wasn't backing down. Jack's hands laced together, his gaze dropping to the control panel. For the first time all night, he was truly considering Derrick's words. A crackle came through the radio. Atlantic 702, confirm position and prepare for descent in 20 minutes. Welcome to Tokyo. Derrick waited. Jack didn't answer. He was hesitating, and Derrick knew one more push would tip the scales. His voice dropped lower, heavier. You're the captain, Jack? Derrick's words were measured, deliberate. But a passenger's life is in both our hands. If we do nothing, he might die in that seat. I can't let that happen. Maybe you can live with that. I can't. Jack stiffened. His eyes flickered, not with defiance this time, but something else. A realization. Are you saying I don't care about my passengers? Jack's voice was quieter now. Derrick shook his head. I'm saying I'm willing to take responsibility. Are you? Jack inhaled sharply, and for just a second his resolve cracked. A single, tense beat. Then he exhaled. A slow nod. Contact Osaka. Jack's voice was low, resigned. Tell them we need an emergency runway. Relief flooded Derrick's chest. He immediately grabbed the comms, steadying his voice. Atlantic 702 requesting route change. Medical emergency on board. Requesting immediate landing at Kansai International, Osaka. The radio was silent for a moment. Then a voice responded. Atlantic 702, request approved. Preparing for emergency landing. Descend to 25,000 feet and stand by for further instructions. Derrick lowered the receiver. Jack didn't look at him, but the ice in his gaze was gone. And Derrick knew Jack had accepted that he was right. Japanese airspace, 8:25 a.m. local time. The Boeing 777 descended rapidly, heading straight for Kansai International Airport, Osaka. Inside the cockpit, Jack Reynolds and Derrick Miles worked in perfect sync, executing every step of the emergency landing procedure with unwavering focus. The tension was still there, but now it wasn't conflict. It was determination. Jack reached for the comm switch, his voice steady and authoritative. Atlantic 702, emergency landing in progress. We have a passenger suffering a suspected heart attack, requesting immediate runway clearance and medical assistance upon arrival. The response from Osaka Air Traffic Control came almost instantly. Atlantic 702, Kansai Airport is ready to receive you. Land on runway 06L. Medical team is standing by. Jack gave a firm nod, then turned to Derrick. You handle the cabin announcement. Derrick grabbed the intercom, keeping his voice calm, professional. Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Miles. Due to a medical emergency, we will be landing at Kansai International Airport in Osaka. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and follow all instructions from the cabin crew. No panic, just uneasy glances, hushed murmurs. In business class, Sarah, the lead flight attendant, was kneeling beside Roger Mathis. His breathing was shallow, his face deathly pale. "He's still with us," Sarah relayed. "But he's getting weaker." Time was running out. Back in the cockpit, Derrick and Jack ran through the final approach checklist. Speed, wind direction, braking system, cabin pressure. Every detail had to be perfect. Jack exhaled, glancing at Derrick. "You want to help bring her in?" Derrick blinked. For the first time during this flight, Jack was offering him real responsibility. Not testing him, not questioning him, trusting him. Derrick nodded, voice firm. "Ready?" Jack said nothing, but the small nod he gave spoke volumes. Derrick placed his hands on the controls, preparing for one of the most critical landings of his career. Outside, the runway at Kansai emerged through a thin veil of mist. Final approach, 10,000 feet. The engines roared as the aircraft lined up for its descent. 5,000 feet. Jack's voice was even. "Hold at 160 knots. Flaps to final approach setting." Derrick adjusted the controls with precision. Flaps set, reducing to 150 knots. Sarah's voice crackled over the radio. "Roger Mathis is still breathing, but it's getting worse." Derrick tightened his grip on the yoke. No mistakes. Not now. 2,000 feet. Lower landing gear. A heavy thud reverberated as the landing gear locked into place. 1,000 feet. Jack's grip on the controls tightened. Steady. 500 feet. The winds picked up, but Derrick stayed calm. His hands were steady. 100 feet. "Keep her balanced," Jack murmured. Derrick made a slight correction, keeping the approach smooth. Then, contact. The landing gear touched down seamlessly. No violent impact. No jarring turbulence. Just a perfect touchdown. Jack instantly engaged reverse thrust and brakes, slowing them from 150 knots to 60 knots in seconds. A collective exhale swept through the cabin. Derrick scanned the instruments one last time, then nodded. "Landing complete. We're down safe." Jack powered down the engines and reached for the radio. "Atlantic 702 has landed. Requesting immediate approach for emergency medical personnel." Kansai International Airport, Osaka, 8:42 a.m. local time. The Boeing 777 had barely come to a complete stop when the ambulance team rushed onto the tarmac. The cabin doors swung open immediately, and within seconds, a team of emergency medics boarded the aircraft. Derrick unbuckled his harness and moved swiftly from the cockpit towards seat 3A, where Roger Mathis lay motionless. His breathing was shallow, his eyes shut. The onboard doctor stepped aside as the paramedics took over. One reached for a heart monitor, while another readied an oxygen mask. Everyone held their breath. Then, a faint, rhythmic beep echoed from the monitor. A heartbeat, weak but still there. Derrick exhaled deeply. Roger was alive. "We need to move him. Now," one of the medics ordered. Sarah, the lead flight attendant, helped the team secure Roger onto the stretcher. Within minutes, they were off the plane and racing toward the ambulance. Derrick stood frozen for a moment, watching as the emergency vehicle sped away. He didn't know if Roger would survive, but at least he had done the right thing. The aftermath. Even after Roger was gone, the cabin remained heavy with tension. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, whispers filling the air. "What just happened? Why did we land here?" Sarah quickly grabbed the intercom, her voice firm but reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, we made an emergency landing to ensure the safety of a passenger experiencing a medical crisis. Thank you for your patience and cooperation." A pause, then applause. Derrick blinked, slightly startled. He turned to see passengers clapping, nodding in appreciation. A middle-aged man gave Derrick an approving look. "Good work, son." An elderly woman placed a hand over her heart, her voice filled with emotion. "You save a life today." Derrick didn't respond with words. He simply nodded, a small, quiet acknowledgement. He hadn't done this for recognition, but in that moment, he understood the weight of his job. The moment of truth. Derrick stepped back into the cockpit. Jack Reynolds was still in the captain's seat, gazing out the window. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jack's voice came, slow, deliberate. "You were right." Derrick looked up. Jack still didn't turn to face him, but his tone had shifted. No sarcasm, no skepticism, just acceptance. It's not just about experience or flight hours. It's about judgment and knowing when to act. Derrick let the words sink in before answering. "I didn't do it for validation. I did it because it was the right thing to do." This time, Jack did turn to look at him. A long pause, then a small nod. "You did good, Miles." There was no hesitation in his voice, no reluctance. For the first time, Jack Reynolds truly saw Derrick as an equal. A shift in the sky. As Derrick left the cockpit, he knew something had changed. From the doubt in Jack's eyes when they first met, to the mockery of Roger Mathis, telling him he didn't belong, none of it mattered anymore, because he had proven himself, not through words but through action. And more importantly, he had proven it to himself. He belonged here. 1 week after the emergency landing, JFK International Airport, New York, 9:30 a.m. Derrick Miles walked through the familiar halls of JFK, a hot coffee in hand. Today was just another flight, but everything felt lighter. The emergency landing in Osaka was behind him, yet its impact remained. Passengers had thanked him. The airline had acknowledged his actions. And most importantly, Jack Reynolds had changed. Derrick leaned back in his seat inside the crew lounge, savoring a rare moment of quiet before takeoff. Then, a flight attendant approached, handing him an envelope. "Miles, someone left this for you." Derrick frowned. A handwritten letter? It had been a long time since he'd received one of those. But when he saw the sender's name, he froze. From Roger Mathis. Slowly, Derrick unfolded the letter and began to read. "Miles, I don't know how to start this, but I suppose I owe you a thank you. And more than that, an apology. If it weren't for your decision that day, I might not have had the chance to write this letter. I was wrong about you. Wrong to underestimate you when we were younger. Wrong to think you weren't capable of what you've achieved. Wrong to believe I was above you. I don't expect you to forget the past, but I want you to know. I learned my lesson, and I am truly grateful. Roger Mathis." Derrick read the words again and again. Roger Mathis, the boy who had tormented him in high school, the man who had doubted him even at 37,000 feet, had written a letter of regret. Derrick set the paper down, staring at it for a moment. Then, he turned to the window, watching as a plane taxied onto the runway. He had faced many storms in his life, but maybe this was the moment he had finally risen above them. An unexpected meeting. Hours later, as Derrick headed toward his departure gate, a familiar voice called from behind. "Miles!" Derrick turned. Roger Mathis stood there, polished suit, crisp tie, but gone was the arrogance. They faced each other in silence. Then, Roger let out a small, almost sheepish chuckle. "Didn't think I'd run into you so soon." Derrick crossed his arms, unreadable. "Didn't think I'd get a letter from you either." Roger exhaled, nodding. "I did a lot of thinking after I got out of the hospital. The doctor said that without the emergency landing, I might not have made it." Derrick didn't reply. He didn't need to say, "I did what was right," or "I was just doing my job." Some things didn't need to be spoken. Roger hesitated, then asked, voice quieter, "Did you ever resent me?" Derrick paused. Then he shook his head. "I never had time to waste on resentment. I was too busy moving forward." Roger let out a short laugh, not mocking, but accepting. "I guess that's why you're standing here. And I'm not." Then, for the first time, Roger offered his hand. Derrick glanced at it. 20 years ago, this was the same hand that had shoved him into lockers, knocked his books to the ground, tried to hold him back. And now, it was an acknowledgement, not of friendship, not of forgiveness, but of truth. Derrick grasped Roger's hand, giving it a firm shake. Then they let go. A chapter closed. "Take care of yourself, Roger," Derrick said. Roger nodded. "You too, Miles?" And then he turned, vanishing into the flow of passengers. Derrick stood there for a moment. Then, without another glance back, he walked toward his next flight. JFK International Airport, Crew Lounge, 2 p.m. After his unexpected encounter with Roger Mathis, Derrick returned to the crew lounge to prepare for his next flight. He was scanning through the flight logs when an administrative staff member stepped into the room, looking around. "First Officer Miles?" Derrick glanced up. "That's me." The woman smiled and handed him an envelope stamped with the official seal of the Atlantic Airways Executive Board. "The management team wants to see you. They're waiting in the office now." Derrick frowned slightly. Had he done something wrong? But instead of worrying, he simply took a slow breath, stood up, and followed her. Inside the conference room, a group of executives sat around a polished table. Among them was Richard Vaughn, CEO of Atlantic Airways, alongside several senior operations directors. In the corner, Jack Reynolds sat with his arms crossed, expression unreadable. Derrick took a seat, maintaining his composure. Vaughn offered a welcoming smile. "Miles, thank you for coming. We wanted to speak with you directly about a very important decision." Derrick remained silent, waiting. Vaughn laced his fingers together, his voice calm but measured. "After the emergency landing in Osaka, we thoroughly reviewed Captain Reynolds' report. And to put it plainly, we were extremely impressed with how you handled the situation." Derrick cast a quick glance toward Jack, but his expression remained neutral. Vaughn continued, "Normally, the promotion to captain requires at least 7 years of experience and 5,000 flight hours. However, in exceptional cases, the board has the discretion to fast-track pilots who demonstrate extraordinary capability." Derrick felt his heartbeat quicken. Vaughn smiled, a knowing glint in his eyes. "Miles, we'd like to offer you an early promotion to captain." Silence filled the room. Derrick froze. Captain, the rank he had worked for, fought for, dreamed of. He blinked, making sure he'd heard correctly. "You mean right now?" Vaughn nodded. "You'll undergo an intensive 3-month captain's training course, after which you'll officially receive your captain's wings. If you accept, we'll begin the process immediately." Derrick didn't hesitate. He sat up straighter, eyes burning with certainty. "I'm ready." Vaughn's smile widened. "Then congratulations, Captain Miles." A round of applause echoed through the room. As Derrick left the conference room, Jack Reynolds followed him into the hallway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Jack exhaled and muttered, "I oppose this decision." Derrick wasn't surprised. He simply raised an eyebrow. "I figured." Jack folded his arms, letting out a long sigh. "But not because I thought you didn't deserve it. I just don't like being proven wrong." Derrick smirked. "Admitting you were wrong isn't easy." "Huh?" Jack actually laughed, a real, genuine chuckle, free of sarcasm. No, it's not." Then, for the first time, Jack extended a hand. "Congratulations, Captain Miles." Derrick hesitated for only a second. Then, he grasped Jack's hand firmly. No words were needed. Jack Reynolds had finally recognized him as an equal. 3 months later, JFK International Airport. Derrick Miles stood on the tarmac, the golden bars of a captain's insignia gleaming on his uniform. In front of him stood a Boeing 787 Dreamliner, his first flight as captain. Inside the cockpit, a young first officer, no older than 26, was already seated, looking eager yet nervous. Just like Derrick had been on his first day, the young pilot stood, extending a hand. "Captain Miles, an honor to fly with you." Derrick smiled and shook his hand firmly. "Just call me Derrick. We're a team." He took his seat in the captain's chair, hands resting on the control panel. Through the cockpit windows, the runway stretched endlessly before him. Then air traffic control crackled in his headset. "Captain Miles, you are cleared to taxi. Prepare for takeoff." Derrick inhaled deeply, fingers tightening around the throttle. He had come so far, and now the sky was his. "Copy that, control. This is Atlantic 320. Ready for departure." And then, he flew. Derrick Miles' story is not just a journey to becoming a pilot. It is a testament to perseverance, courage, and the power of believing in oneself. In life, we all face prejudice, doubt, and challenges, whether in our careers or personal lives. But like Derrick, instead of letting them hold us back, we must use our actions to prove our worth. Stand firm in your convictions. Always do what is right and never stop learning. Success is not defined by the recognition of others. It is born from the unwavering faith you have in yourself. Mot Chuyen Bay, Mot Quiet Din Va, Mot Su Thay Doi Kong Ngio. Lu Derrick Ko Tuk Su Chin Fu Bao Troy. Heyday Chi Lok Hoi Dao Cho and Hung Thursday, Thatch Teep Theo. Heyda Lai Bin Luan Va Theo Doi De Kong, Bo Lo and Hung Ka Chien Hap Dan Teep Theo.